see it's increasing drastically. Maybe we can start in the next 2 minutes. Good. Once again, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to today's webinar based on the topic of hydrogen regulations, standard codes and certification. My name is Nicholas Musyoka. I work for the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research. And I'm currently a research group leader, leading a team of researchers who are working on technology and innovation developments at the CSIR, and as well as also making contributions in the space of hydrogen safety codes and standards. And today's webinar, it provides an important platform for sharing knowledge and information from the team of panelists that are going to be introduced. Of course, some of them will make presentations, and also they'll participate in answering some of the questions that we have from the attendants. The basis for this event stemmed from the government decision back in 2008 to establish what was the basis for these hydrogen engagements in South Africa, which was the National Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Technology Research Development and Innovation Strategy that was branded as Hydrogen South Africa, in short, abbreviated as HySA. Over the last 15 years, a lot of things have happened, to a point that some of the technologies have gone to be demonstrated at real scale, real world applications in various places in the country. Of course, the recent culmination of this engagement is the development and the launching of the South African Society Roadmap, which technically aims to streamline all aspects that are geared towards unlocking the opportunities within the full potential of hydrogen value chain in the country, while stimulating socioeconomic benefits that are related to this important topic. The initiative also culminated in or resulted in the release of a feasibility study, which technically led to shed a light with regard to the creation of a hydrogen valley in South Africa, which is aimed at stimulating demonstration and development of the hydrogen value chain in the country. And of course, also engaging other stakeholders within the partnering communities, just to make sure that we can have some of these benefits already starting to manifest as early as possible. Like I indicated, the works on hydrogen safety codes and standards has been mostly conducted by the HySA Center of Competence, which is co-hosted by Northwest University and the CSIR. But looking at the recent development and excitement within the hydrogen space, it is dictating that this engagement needs to be expanded to make sure that it encompasses or attracts the attention of other stakeholders within the academic and industry space. And in this particular thing, this is one of the key engagements that I think is aimed to try and share this knowledge, and of course try to identify partners amongst ourselves as partners, as panelists, and of course as participants for this particular webinar. It is also important to highlight that the aspects of hydrogen safety codes, standards, regulations, and certification is a very important topic that, if not looked at or bypassed, it can become a very big bottleneck when it comes to the actualization of these benefits in the hydrogen economy. Having said that, I just wanted to make sure that I can share with you some of the baseline slides that are going to be talking about some of the terminologies that are going to be discussed or hinted or highlighted by some of our speakers. And having said that, I'll just briefly share the screen with you colleagues, just to make sure that we are able to be on the same platform. Sometimes it is easy just to assume that everybody is on the same page with regard to some of these technologies, and I thought maybe it would be a good opportunity for us to share that. Now, when you talk about standards, we are referring to repeatable and harmonized, agreed and also documented way of doing something, which is slightly different from the codes, because codes are a system of rules that are legally binding by the government. But the key difference between the codes and the standards is that the codes tells one what needs to be done, but the standards allow more on how one should do it. Of course, from a regulation point of view, it is an imposition by the government in terms of the rules that needs to be adhered to. And when these rules are adhered, it enables the manifestation of the hydrogen economy in a safe, reliable environment. And of course, facilitate, which is the end goal, the utilization of hydrogen as a fuel carrier. And having said that, standards are very important because they assist in supporting policy development mechanism in terms of compliance. Of course, also creating confidence and trust within the community that is engaged in the standards making. And of course, also important for the project developers because it gives them assurances that the testing and the sampling of materials and the technologies that are going to be engaged are adhered to the manufacturers and the requirements of the installers. Of course, it also gives confidence to the investors and financial bodies, such as the multinational development banks and investment banks, to be able to verify and come up with means to make sure that everything is done according to mechanism that can de-risk some of the investments that are going to be put into place. Of course, I did talk about the policymakers, the legislators. It gives consistency when something is standardized. And importantly, is to create the users' confidence with regards to aspects touching on consumer protection, making sure that there are guarantees in terms of how some of these technologies are designed, manufactured and installed, and importantly, protect the environment and deal with all the concerns that are there. So having that, given that brief introduction with regards to the hydrogen, importance of the hydrogen standards, it's also important to understand who is responsible for these standard making. There are four levels of these standard making bodies. The first one is the international standards bodies, such as the International Organization for Standardization, which is the ISO, which has 164 members. There are also regional standard making bodies, such as those based in Europe, Africa, Asia Pacific, Middle East, which is the regional classification. And of course, at the national point of view, at a country level, we have standard making bodies such as the South African Bureau of Standards. And of course, even from an organizational point of view, for example, ESCOM can decide to have their own standards with regard to the SASO. But I think the most important thing is the national standard making body and of course, the international standard making body, because those are the key ones that play an important role that can be overarching within the spectra of the various stakeholders. Now, having given you that flavor of the definitions of some of the terminologies that will be heard today, it's important to highlight how the webinar will manifest itself. We started at 10 o'clock, of course, with these opening remarks. And of course, for those who had registered and seen this document, the essence is to try and provide some of the recent developments and progress that has happened within the space that you're talking about today. And of course, also create a profile and celebrate South Africa's achievement in the hydrogen safety, in the hydrogen fuel cell technologies, and of course see how that interfaces with what is going to be presented. We are going to have 4 speakers for today, with an additional panelists who will be participating in the question and answer session. The way the program will be run is that we are going to start with the presenters. We are not going to be taking questions after each presenter has presented their work. We'll reserve the questions towards the question and answer session. And of course, we'll start with the questions that have been posted in the chat box. Then thereafter, we're going to open the space for the participants to verbalize their questions. And of course, also get some comments and views from our colleague, Dr. Kavaren Dwerambao. Then thereafter, we're going to have our closing remarks from the NRF SASTA colleague. Having said that, I'd like to welcome everybody for this webinar for today, so that we can share knowledge and exchange knowledge with ourselves, just to ensure that we can actually track what is happening within the country and see how we can accelerate the deployment of these hydrogen technologies within the country. So I'd like to take this opportunity to invite our first speaker, Mr. Lawrence Klutz, who is from the Rebels Group Advisory South Africa. He is a senior consultant within the organization, and his talk today is going to be entitled South Africa's Readiness for the Hydrogen Society from a regulations, standards, and certification perspective. And I'm just going to give you a brief background with regard to who Mr. Lawrence Klutz is. Lawrence is an experienced science, technology, and innovation expert with a background in electronic engineering. He has a master's and bachelor's degree in electronic engineering from the University of Pretoria, and he has served in various leadership positions at the CSIR, which eventually culminated in his appointment as a CSR group executive in operations back in 2014. Since 2018, he's been a senior consultant with the company that I mentioned, the Rebels Group, and his main focus is on technology, policy, and economics in the energy, hydrogen, digital, and pharmaceutical sector. And of course, his current focus is on green hydrogen, including regulations, code standards, green certification, economic impact analysis, and he's worked on projects for organizations such as the IDC, GIZ, European Union, and the African Union, and has also assisted South Africa in benchmarking some of the work that's being done in the regulation codes and standards against the global best practices. Having said that, I would like to welcome you, Mr. Klutz, so that you can share with us your presentation. The presentation lasts for around 20 minutes, so please try to stick on time. Thank you.
Am I audible now?
Absolutely, yes. And you can even see you.
And you can see my presentation?
Yes, you can see it. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and welcome to this webinar. I think it's very exciting that we have such a good attendance on something that's perhaps not the most sexiest of topics, regulations, codes, and standards. But I think it shows South Africans' enthusiasm for hydrogen and green hydrogen specifically. So the context of my talk is that the Rebel Group, in partnership with a German company called Ludwig Bolkhoff Systemtechnik, or for short LBST, were involved or drove a project funded by the German government through GIZ on regulations, codes, and standards. And this is within the framework of a broader cooperation between South Africa and Germany, specifically the presidency called H2SA, which is around promoting the development of a hydrogen economy for South Africa. So I just want to acknowledge the funding support from GIZ and the cooperation we had from the presidency and other players in South Africa. So without further ado, let me say one thing about Rebel, because you might not have heard about us before. We're a Dutch headquartered advisory firm that is very active in the renewable energy and hydrogen sector. And this slide has a few of our projects, which ranges from studying, for instance, hydrogen import supply chains for the Port of Rotterdam, supporting Tunisia and Mauritania on hydrogen export. Then the project I'm going to talk about today on hydrogen regulation codes and standards. We also worked with Mahendra and the IDC on estimating the economic impact of the green hydrogen commercialization strategy. And we've worked with the Department of Science and Innovation on hydrogen fuel cell technology on the HySA program before. But let me move to the topic at hand. I'm going to briefly give you an introduction on the scope and methodology, and then go straight into the findings and recommendations. And really, in a webinar like this, I can only give you a taste because this is a vast topic, and people like Dr. Brian North and others on this webinar have worked in this for many years, and I'm sure we can have a long discussion. So the project that we did, as I said, it's done in a context of a set of projects that is looking at getting South Africa more ready for the hydrogen economy. But our focus was specifically on regulations, codes, and standards. There was a sister project that looked more broadly at things like tariffs and things like wheeling and so on. That was not within our scope. Ours was purely on the technical regulations, codes, and standards across the hydrogen value chain, plus green hydrogen certification. Our approach and methodology consisted of 4 steps. We firstly did an extensive desktop study, and in that study, we reviewed both the international situation on regulations, codes, and standards, as well as where South Africa stands. We then had a set of stakeholder interviews where we confirmed our desktop findings and got some additional information from stakeholders. We then did a gap analysis in terms of how does what is missing in the international standards, and then how does South Africa compare in terms of the international standards, codes, and regulations. And lastly, we developed a set of final recommendations, and we had 2 public workshops. The one was in May last year, and then in September last year. And I'm unfortunately not 100% sure if our report is public yet, but if it's not, I'm sure it will be in due course. We've also had a workshop with SABS recently, which is considering starting a technical committee, which I can't remember the code of now, but that's relevant to this topic. So what we did to get some organization around this topic is we used the value chain approach. So we went right from production, where, as you, I'm sure, are aware, green hydrogen is hydrogen that's produced through the electrolysis of water, and the electricity that is used to do that electrolysis to split the water into hydrogen and oxygen has to be renewable. And that is very relevant on the green certification. The other way, of course, is to do steam methane reforming, where you transform gas or coal into hydrogen, but that has no real environmental benefit, and that's not the topic of what we're interested in. But of course, the regulations, codes, and standards for hydrogen that come from that world is equally applicable to green hydrogen. And so then for each of these, I'm giving an example. In the case of production, there's an ISO standard, hydrogen generators using water electrolysis. And that's just one example. There are many, many more. Internationally, a lot of work has been done on this. Then there's conditioning, which includes things like compression, liquefaction, hydrogenation, sorry for slipping on that. And there's an example of a machine directive 2006/42/EC and the standard EN 1012-1. But again, there are many of those. Then transport, Hydrogen can be transported in many ways, railroad, ship, and of course pipelines. And there are some hydrogen pipelines in South Africa, which may not be well known. So we looked at that, and there's again international standards and globally, and South Africa being a UN member, we also have access to the UN model regulations, so we can adopt those regulations and adapt them to our conditions. And then lastly, end use, and then I think many of you may know that the big opportunity, the reason why we're looking at green hydrogen is because of climate change. We need to decarbonize our energy systems. And while we can do a lot of that through electrification, using renewable energy, there are some things where we can't do that, the so-called hard to abate sectors, which include transport. Although battery vehicles will solve part of that problem, at the moment, the thinking is that heavy vehicles will not be battery powered. It takes too long to charge them, and the batteries have to be too big. Maritime ships is another area where batteries won't work. Aviation, you may be able to power a small aeroplane using batteries, but if you want to travel to Europe or anywhere like that, you will need a fuel like hydrogen or a derivative. And then various industrial processes, of which I think the most well-known is iron and steel making, which requires high heat, but also has a reduction process for which you need a gas, and hydrogen can be a carbon-free gas to do that. And again, there are regulations, codes, and standards for that. So that we did in the desktop study. And then we had semi-structured interviews with stakeholders in different stakeholder groupings. And on the right, you see the logos, I think, of most of the people that we have interviewed. And most stakeholders understand that the regulations, codes, and standards are key to developing a hydrogen economy in South Africa. And I think we make the point that if you want an economy, you can't do things on an ad hoc basis. You need a system of regulations, codes, and standards. And this is recognized in the Hydrogen Society Roadmap. And I think there's mention of it in the Green Hydrogen Commercialization Strategy as well. South Africa is not new to producing hydrogen. We've made ammonia, I think, for 100 years in Modderfontein. We've been producing hydrogen, and in general, what my chemical engineer friends call within the battery limits, that's in a factory premises, in an industrial area, we generally know what we're doing. We have an Occupational Health and Safety Act, we have environmental legislation, and companies like Sasol that already produce hydrogen comply with those regulations. But if we want to have a green hydrogen economy, we want to go beyond that. We want to transport hydrogen on our roads. We want to use it to fuel our trucks. And the other difference is that the scale at which we're going to do things is going to be completely different. People are talking about gigawatt scale. Renewable energy generation, that in itself is an interesting challenge, although South Africa knows how to build renewable generation capacity. But I think the point is that the scale of the hydrogen economy is also providing new challenges. So there's many of the stakeholders feel that the green economy in South Africa will be export-led. I think the green hydrogen commercialization strategy that Mahendra will talk about has an equal balance between domestic use and export. And I think South Africa is an interesting exporter in that sense, that we both have a substantial domestic market and an export market, which I think is a competitive advantage for South Africa. Okay, so to make sense of this big world of hydrogen, we decided to focus on a few use cases. And I think we looked at in one additional one, which I'm not going to talk about today, and that is green steel making. But since that's mainly in a factory environment, I'm not going to talk about that so much. But the three that we presented at our workshop was firstly sustainable aviation fuels based on renewable hydrogen. I think I've made the point that we need solutions other than direct electrification in the aviation environment. And the most suitable solution there is sustainable aviation fuel. And some ways of making sustainable aviation fuel is based on a combination of sustainable carbon and green hydrogen. So, and there's various international regulations like CORSIA and so on that's applicable to the aviation world and so on. Then the other big one is, of course, export of renewable hydrogen. And I'm going to show a few more slides on that about what's involved there. And then lastly, road transport. How do you license a vehicle that's powered by hydrogen and how do you refuel them and so on. So this is a little schematic diagram, and the more we work in hydrogen, the more we understand how complex this issue is. And you can see 19 sort of facilities that potentially have to be permitted, that have to comply to standards and so on. And it starts right from your solar PV, which of course you can have concentrated solar, and then your wind, which can be onshore and offshore. And the offshore, it would be very new for South Africa. I think Mauritania is possibly going to be the first African country that will have offshore wind, but there's a recent study by Stellenbosch University that indicates South Africa has significant potential for offshore in addition to our good onshore wind potential. And then, of course, something that always comes to mind in hydrogen, you need quite a lot of water to make hydrogen, but through desalination, you can do that without negatively impacting on the water scarcity in South Africa. And then through to water electrolysis and so on. So this gives you an idea of the scope of hydrogen regulations, codes, and standards. So what did we find? So example use case, RCS for green hydrogen export. So on the standard side, internationally, there are various ISO, European, there's some American standards. And the good thing about standards is that they, I think, can be changed quite easily. It's a quicker process. It's in a way a form of soft law. So standards are very important because the legislative process is slower, and it's better to refer to standards than to encode some of the technical detail in regulation. So on standards, the world is actually doing quite well. There are areas where there's still some missing issues. Regulations, internationally, there are country-specific permitting for all the key processes for hydrogen export. The International Maritime Organization has adopted a resolution on interim recommendations for the carriage of liquefied hydrogen in bulk. But I think in the shorter term, hydrogen is likely to be exported as ammonia, which is something that's already being done. So that is not really new. Powering ships through hydrogen, through ammonia, that is a new thing. There's also efforts to look at hydrogen as a propulsion fuel in the maritime environment. And I think maybe to say why maritime is important to South Africa, we're of course at the southern end of the African continent. So some of the shipping routes go past South Africa, and there's almost a way for us to for free export our green hydrogen. On the regulation, on the South African side, currently, from what we could establish, there's no specific standards for hydrogen processes. But of course, there are many ITSAN standards that are applicable in the hydrogen world. And there's this new effort by SABS to look at a specific standardization process. Regulations, a lot of our regulations flows from the OSH Act, things like hazardous chemical substances, pressure equipment, construction regulations. as well as then the environmental legislation. South Africa has got very sophisticated and advanced environmental legislation. Our current Gas Act does not cover hydrogen because the Gas Act is concerned with hydrocarbons, and pure hydrogen does not include carbon. Therefore, hydrogen is excluded from that. There has been submissions to in terms of that process to include hydrogen by industry, and I understand that this is under consideration. So that could be one way of bringing some sorting out some of the regulations on hydrogen, and there could be pros and cons to including it to the Gas Act, which I won't pronounce on now, but certainly that's an option that we could look at. So a little bit about our findings and recommendations. So as I said, on the international green hydrogen context, various territories with high renewable potential are proactively pursuing their own hydrogen strategies. So I think this is important, that we are not alone. We are not the only people that have seen this opportunity. I think South America, very much similar to Africa, Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, all those countries are moving fast, Chile in particular. And then in North Africa, Egypt, Morocco, now Tunisia as well. And then our neighboring country, Namibia, who we like to see as a partner, not as a competitor, but also the Middle East that are very much aware that the world is going to move away from fossil fuels to green fuels. They are also moving. So I think that's the context of what we're talking about here, and I think NRF and SASTA need to be congratulated on taking up this baton and running with it. International progress, there are many relevant standards for hydrogen. There are some standards still underway in areas like heavy-duty vehicle refueling, and so on. I should say there's interesting things, for instance, in Germany and as well as in California. There's, for instance, a guideline on how to permit your hydrogen refueling station. And since this is not a trivial exercise, it's very much needed. Green hydrogen certification. This is about how do you know that the hydrogen you're putting in your tank or using in your factory is actually green, it's sustainable, and there's various efforts on that, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So what is the status quo in South Africa? Inside the battery limits, in factories, we know what we're doing. We've been doing it for a long time. And I think we have a good track record there. Brian can correct me if he differs with me. But outside the battery limits, in our suburbs, on our highways and so on, we have work to do, and including the homologation of hydrogen-powered vehicles. Currently, we also have no green hydrogen certification mechanism in South Africa. When I wrote the slide, I mentioned that the Hydrogen Society roadmaps highlights the criticality of RCS across the value chain. And I think the same goes for the commercialization strategy. We are starting to see the uptake of green hydrogen. I was at a seminar recently where Sasol said they will be producing green hydrogen this year. So this is no longer something of the future. It's very much happening. So the implications, if we want a green hydrogen economy, as we do, this requires a comprehensive approach to RCS. Green hydrogen certification is critical for exports of hydrogen. The countries that are wanting to import green hydrogen, that don't have enough renewable resources, are doing it to lower their carbon footprint, so they will be very particular about the carbon content of the hydrogen and the general sustainabilities. I think the important thing is their certification follows the market. If we want to sell into Europe or into Japan or Korea, we need to understand what their requirements are. And in any case, in domestic consumption, a lot of good work has been done on green hydrogen certification. We should learn from that. We propose that RCS should be prioritized based on the big use cases, and that we should have a step-by-step process. And I'll make some remarks about an agile process. The international RCS and green hydrogen certification, in a way, is a global public good that we can take part in. We take part in things like the ISO processes and so on, and we can adapt, and contribute to these initiatives, in many cases at no cost or very low cost. We think that given South Africa's distance from international markets, although one mustn't overemphasize the cost of exporting hydrogen, the biggest cost is your electrolysis, where our excellent renewable resources put us at an advantage. But because we also have a value-adding industry, we should look at adding value by making things like green steel and then building cars from that are fully green from the start. One of the challenges we picked up with RCS is that this spans multiple government departments' mandates. There is a little bit of unevenness in the current buy-in from departments, but I think the championship of the presidency will ensure that we have the necessary action within government, but there is a need for better alignment and strong leadership and coordination. And we also think there's a need for a one-stop shop approach to permitting, and there's some thoughts on that. Okay, so our key recommendations from the project that we did was that SAP should drive a process specifically for hydrogen standards to address gaps in the standard landscapes. On regulations, there should be a strong coordinator that will ensure alignment, that the relevant department needs to then drive the processes. Regulations should refer to standards as far as possible, and we should complement permitting procedures with step-by-step guidelines and a one-stop shop. Green hydrogen certification, which I think is not the core of today's workshop and could be a topic in and of itself. We think that South Africa should select international schemes that satisfy the requirements of the markets we want to sell into, and then develop a national certification scheme using best practice. We also think that South Africa should focus on 4 to 6 clusters where there's a nascent hydrogen ecosystem. I'm realizing I'm going slightly over time, so I'm going to go a bit faster. So this is a little bit about green hydrogen certification. Maybe in the interest of time, I won't go into that in any detail, but the slides will be shared. These are some examples, both of voluntary schemes, and then there's legislation in Europe and in other territories as well. And let me end the presentation there to allow the other presenters also to get their chance. Chair, back to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lawrence, for the nice presentation. I think for me, the key highlight is the summary of the findings, their implications, and of course, the key recommendations that the study did come up with. I think this is quite important, and like you said, the presentation will also be shared with the participants so that they can also engage with it, especially on the slides that you've not talked about. So that is a good opportunity. So for the sake of staying within the time limits that we have, I'd like to introduce the second presenter. His name is Mahendra Ruplal. He's from the Industrial Development Corporation, IDC. And his topic is titled Green Hydrogen Commercialization Strategy. Just a brief highlight of who our presenter is. He's an industry strategist and planner, and is currently engaged with the development of national hydrogen commercialization strategy at the moment. And of course, he has a degree in electronics engineering and an MBA. And of course, he's a registered professional engineer with a project management profession. Of course, he's worked in various companies, and of course, the key highlight is the 11 years that is being engaged in undertaking investment analysis and risk management on major investments. Having said that in brief, I'd like to welcome you, Mr. Mahandra, to kindly share with us your knowledge. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Musyoka. Firstly, we want to confirm you can see my presentation in PowerPoint presentation mode and hear me.
We can see the presentation, but it's not yet in the load-up version. Perhaps you can just put it in PPT presentation mode.
Okay, let me try and do that again. Sorry about that. Can you see it now?
Not yet. Perhaps there is a slight delay.
Okay.
I think you have to choose the other screen when you share.
Yeah, I think that's a problem. Sorry about that. Let me just stop sharing and try again. Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen again, and then we'll start in a minute. Can you confirm that you can see presentation mode now, please?
Not yet. I'm not really sure why, but
Okay.
if you cannot get it, maybe you can just try to expand the slides and just move through the slides for the interest
Okay,
of time.
let's not waste more time. Sorry about this. It did work when we tried it earlier. So let me just minimize this part and then we'll start. Okay, hoping this is a bit better. And thank you. Firstly, good morning to all of you. Thanks for joining this webinar. Thanks for introduction, Dr. Musyoka. And I'll just introduce myself also quickly. I'm working at the IDC as an industry planner, but I also wear another hat where I'm working as a secretariat of the Green Hydrogen Panel. I'll tell you a bit about that later. But going quickly into our presentation, I'm presenting the green hydrogen commercialization strategy. And it's not a technical presentation. It's meant to provide guidance on where we need to focus when it comes to standards and certification. What I want to cover today is the history in the country, a bit of the opportunity statement for South Africa. We look at the demand drive side, how South Africa then can respond to that from a competitive supply perspective. I'll give you a summary of the commercialization strategy, some of the key enablers, what's the implications for standards, regulations, and certification, and then conclusion and closing. So presently, the green hydrogen commercialization strategy is in the public domain for comments. Some history on this: it builds on the strong foundation of the work undertaken by the Department of Science and Innovation. And we also recognize the HySA program, which Dr. North will, I think, talk a bit more about. We also recognize the Hydrogen Society Roadmap that was released to the public in February 2022. So we've come thus far, thankfully, to DSI and HySA, who have brought us here. Now, we recognize also recently activity in the country and globally focusing on commercialization aspects. And in this context, the Minister of Trade and Industry then established the Green Hydrogen Panel to develop the commercialization action plan and strategy. This was then approved by Cabinet for public release in November 2022, and is now out in the public domain. You're welcome to still send comments through by the 31st of March. Thank you. So the history, as I mentioned, to recognize what has brought us here. South Africa is not new. We started off in 2007 with the National Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Technology Strategy by the Department of Science and Innovation, approved by Cabinet. We started the HySA program. Over the next 10 or so years, there was a lot of demonstration activity around different aspects of projects, which is very important for moving into commercialization. And more recently, we've seen activity and support from various places. I mentioned the Hydrogen Society Roadmap in February 2022, but we also had presidency supporting this as one of the big 5 investment frontiers. One of the early provinces that took the lead is Northern Cape, where they presented their strategy at COP26. And then came the commercialization strategy. I think, we need to recognize that we embarking on a task that's mammoth from a size perspective and complexity. And before we embark on this, it's so important for us to be aligned on why we're doing this. And this is framed in 4 key areas. We do see that the green hydrogen economy presents new opportunities for South Africa for energy security, economic development, skills development and job creation, and community development. The first key area of opportunities is opportunity to decarbonize. I think Lauren spoke about this, where you can do more than renewable energy from a decarbonization perspective as you penetrate things like processes like aviation fuel production, steel production, etc. By using green hydrogen as a replacement in those processes, you can decarbonize much more. Secondly, there's a global market that we can respond to from South Africa, and also a local market. And this is an opportunity for us to trade. Thirdly, it's an opportunity for South Africa to position itself in the global hydrogen industry as a competitive player by utilizing some of those natural endowments that we have. I think we know what these are, things like our wind and solar resources, land availability, green minerals, and we can differentiate ourselves in things like a petrochemical base that we have and the PGM resources that's used in the equipment. And finally, the 4th area of opportunity is that this is a new industry that we're developing, and we can proactively support socioeconomic development. And in doing so, we can support this just energy transition. Moving on. So this green hydrogen commercialization strategy we see will enable the achievement of a 2050 green hydrogen vision that we set ourselves for. And the role of the commercialization strategy is to create national coordination. It will provide policy certainty, encourage investors, will guide decision makers, and ensure that we have proactive industry development going forward. So looking at some of the demand drive aspects that came as inputs into our commercialization strategy, we analyzed the international industry and potential for local demand. Firstly, the key drivers that's looking at a longer term ambition of globally of 607 million tons per annum, which is quite a big number. But what's driving that is decarbonization efforts. Example, EU regulations and policies, blending mandates. Then there's the need, aligned to that, the need to convert from gray to green. The other key demand is supply and demand balances globally. We have the renewable energy endowments better than certain places in Europe, and we can therefore generate green hydrogen cheaper. There's the technology drive, the cost competitiveness and availability and access to supporting ecosystems. Okay, this number that you see there is a big number, but it's not the number that then we need to differentiate what will be imported, what percentage of that will be imported, and the number we come to is 30 to 60 million tons potential for importation by countries. Okay, of this, South Africa will need to see what percentage we want to be able to take part in exporting to these countries. So in that regards, firstly, before going into the numbers, the areas that we want to target in terms of applications include things like ammonia production, methanol production, refineries, steel generation, heavy duty transportation, and at a longer term, power and heat generation. What does that mean in terms of quantities from an export potential? We've done analysis. We see we can plate 4 to 8 million tons by 2050. That's green hydrogen numbers. And then from a domestic perspective, something equal, as Lawrence mentioned, around 3 to 6 million tons by 2050. Okay, now just bring into context what this means from a global perspective. Globally, there will be a need for 30 to 60 million tons. So we're not targeting a massive percentage. It's a very realistic percentage that we're targeting, 4 to 8 billion tons to export. So now moving into how South Africa can respond to that. So we've seen the market, but what can we do? Firstly, how do we compare ourselves globally? Okay, there's a number of countries out there that have published hydrogen strategies. And South Africa is one of them. But the important thing is, although we've come on board as far as commercialization is concerned, we are a bit behind and we have to hit the ground running. Secondly, however, we do realize we have certain endowments. And these are, as I mentioned, the renewable energy capacity factors, land availability. We do have access to water, and we do have Fischer-Tropsch technology which can be used for those chemicals and derivatives production, and PGMs can be used in equipment manufacturing. Okay. Then we've looked at how can we fare globally in terms of the hydrogen production cost. We've seen that we can target in the long run 2050 around 1 to 1.25 euros per kg. We can reach there around 2045, and we can be the cheapest in the world. But as you see here, not the only one that will produce cheaply. Another emphasis to differentiate ourselves and move with speed. Okay. Now the two key drivers, and let me just get a pointer quickly. Okay. Anyway, I'm hoping you can see here the two key drivers are declining cost in renewable energy, which contributes 60% to the cost of green hydrogen production, and your declining cost in electrolysis production, which is what we show here. So what we're trying to say is that this is a feed-forward cycle. The declining costs, economies of scale is going to bring down prices further progressively over the years, allowing us to penetrate different applications as we show here. Okay, so what does this all mean from a strategy perspective? Firstly, what does it mean from production targets? So we've set ourselves production targets, 7 million tons by 2050 that we will ramp up. And this means a lot of money is required also, which we need to ramp up going forward. So how do we achieve those targets? Firstly, we target export markets in Europe and the East, very important to balance it off between Europe and the East for a number of reasons. Countries like Japan and South Korea in the East, but in the West, we've got Europe and the UK. Domestically, we've identified the mining industry, industrial decarbonization in hard-to-abate sectors, chemicals industry, and then aviation as industries we successfully want to penetrate. So what does that mean in terms of the strategy? So in summary, what we're saying is the 6 key elements of the strategy entails, firstly, making sure we take full advantage of the export markets. From a timing perspective, that's going to make sense because we're getting pricing subsidies to help the price differentials. Secondly, the domestic market is also very important, and that needs to be stimulated by ensuring that we also develop projects for local consumption. And this is areas like aviation fuel, green steel, and mobility. Thirdly, supporting localization of manufacturing of equipment along the value chain, starting off with renewable energy equipment like solar panels, wind towers, but more importantly, going into things like manufacturing of fuel cell components and electrolyzer components. Fourthly, we need the finance. The important thing is, if you look at the numbers, we need to crowd in from various sources. And as we develop projects, we need things like grants, concessional debts, contract for difference, or those pricing subsidies. The fifth key element of the commercialization strategy is proactive socio-economic development. We need to support the just transition. And number 6 at the bottom, related to what he's speaking of today, is the role of government in policy and regulatory support. Government needs to create this conducive environment from a regulatory and policy perspective to support investments. And that, as I'll show later, means making those necessary changes in this regard. So all of that was put into an action plan, which you'll find in the commercialization strategy, much more detailed than this. Okay, along those different areas in the short, medium, long-term actions for both the private sector and the public sector. So all of that needs to happen, but it needs to be supported by the 6 key enablers. Firstly, there needs to be national coordination, especially around the infrastructure requirements. Things like, do we need a hydrogen gas pipeline? Do we need to wheel electricity? What's going to happen with the ports? Which ports are supported when? Where do we need rail infrastructure? Electricity transmission. Okay, so that needs to all be coordinated from a national perspective. Number 2 is what we're talking about today is that conducive environment that needs to be created from a regulatory and policy perspective, including codes, standards, and certification. The third key enabler is funding investment, which I spoke about earlier. Number 4 is project development execution. Also very important for codes and standards. You know, these early projects will provide the guinea pigs to test some of these standards that we want to develop. So we need to support the development of what we call these catalytic projects. Skills development is number 5, and key part of that is creating the new skills for retaining jobs from existing industries that will lose jobs. And number 6 is financial support mechanisms, things like tax incentives, grants, concessional debt, carbon subsidies, etc. So what does it all imply from standards, regulations, and certification perspectives? Just to summarize all of that. Now, I think the other speakers will mention the need, the why, and I think Lawrence touched on this, why we need this. We need it for various reasons, for safety reasons, for certification reasons, for regulatory reasons, right? So some of the areas that this commercialization strategy provides guidance on is we need environmental regulations are critical, and safety regulations to maximize benefits and minimize the harm, obviously, right? Secondly, standards is a massive requirement for the definition of what is green hydrogen, especially if you exporting to Europe. The EU has strict legislation regarding this. So South Africa needs to determine what we will regard as green, and we need a standard around that, but also around blending, around infrastructure, around transmission and storage facilities. Then there's a need for certification related to if you want to export. Something called a book and claim system also needs to be looked at. And from a regulatory aspect, we'll look at things like an integration energy plan, which needs to be updated and aligned to what we're doing here on green hydrogen. The IRP updating to include planning for renewable energy for green hydrogen, classification as gas or energy, and generally to review and amend specific regulations to support green hydrogen, like 700 bar pressure vessels, homologation of hydrogen vehicles, etc. I think the important thing is now our local SABS is currently driving the process. Working groups have been set up recently, very early stages, but we have started the process working on this. So in conclusion, and my last slide is that we're working towards this 2050 vision, where we see this as an important part of supporting our reconstruction program in the country, and which will lead towards this vision 2050 of a well-established new sustainable green hydrogen industry for South Africa. Thank you very much. I hope I stuck to time, and I'll hand over back to you, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rupal, for a very interesting presentation with regard to the commercialization strategy in South Africa. I think they are very nice insights that of course, most of the participants will find very relevant. Having said that, I'd like to move to the next presenter for the interest of time. And in this case, you're going to have a presentation from Dr. Brian North, who will give us a talk based on the challenges in hydrogen RCS stakeholder engagements in South Africa. Dr. North has been working in the energy space for a very long period of time. He was previously from the CSIR, but is currently engaged in consultancy endeavors. Of course, he obtained his PhD in chemical and metallurgical engineering from Wits University in 2013. And he's been one of the core members of the CSIR HISA Infrastructure Center of Competence for quite some time. And he's been engaged with the work that has been talked about with regard to the hydrogen regulation codes and standards, which is the foundation of some of the work that we continue to do at the CSIR. Brian, I'd like to hand over the floor to you.
Good, thank you, Nicholas. Right, let me see if I can get this sharing right as well. Okay, I think it's sharing in edit mode. Ah, there we go. Good. Nicholas, can I just check that you're seeing the slideshow correctly?
Yes, I can see the slides, see you and hear you. Thank you.
Good, thank you. Good. Okay, I've actually cut a couple of slides out, partly because they've been covered and we're slightly behind time as well. I've also renamed my presentation slightly, so there's some overlap with what Lawrence has talked about as well. So I'm going to give a bit of a background to HySA. I think Nicholas has covered that to a certain extent already. A little bit on the existing hydrogen regulation codes and standards in South Africa. Lawrence has done quite a bit in that. Some of the installations in South Africa, quite a few people aren't aware that we do have actually some hydrogen installations here, both generation and use in terms of fuel cells. Want to highlight something that Lawrence did mention. I think that the assistance that we can get from the international safety community and some important resources, and then a bit of a conclusions and acknowledgement. So way back to the roots of HySA, it was mentioned it started in 2007. I think the CSR joined in about 2009. But the question was, what would a hydrogen economy mean to South Africa? That question was asked by the Department of Science and Technology as it was then, now the DSI. And the answer was a bit strange. It's the PGMs, and in particular platinum. And the reason for that was that South Africa possesses 75% of the world's PGM reserves. And then the thing was, well, that's not a major problem, because at the moment, our major market for our PGMs is catalytic converters to reduce NOx emissions from vehicles. But if we're not burning petrol and diesel in the cars, we don't need the catalytic converters. What we will need is fuel cell catalysts, also involving PGMs. But is that actually the case? Because PGMs were starting to become one of the major cost components of fuel cells and, in fact, electrolyzers as well, most of the rest of the world are trying to develop PGM-free solutions. So our kind of goal was to develop an affordable, if you like, PGM solution. So continue to use PGMs in the field of hydrogen and fuel cell technology. I think there was a goal of 25% of the world market of fuel cell catalysts. Been mentioned as well, more recently, as South Africa is amongst the highest solar installation in the world. Just to sort of show that, this is a map that my ex-colleague Thomas Roos has shown quite often, the solar installation in South Africa. We have massive resources here. I was actually at a conference in Australia. I pointed out we have the little town of Hot as Hell, because it is as hot as hell. So we have all these resources. Wasn't really mentioned, where do we have the water? Here we have the water, very far away from where we have the electricity. Do we pump salt water? Do we desalinate, pump fresh water? Or do we wheel the electricity down to the coast? Probably the latter, but then the wheeling costs have to be regulated and made reasonable, to be honest, as well. So in terms of the awareness of hydrogen and hydrogen codes and standards, we're still a relative newcomer in the hydrogen scene. Another relative newcomer is Australia, and I must say I'm extremely impressed at how quickly Australia has ramped things up. They've seen an opportunity, green hydrogen trade with Japan, and they've really accelerated their game there. In general, the public awareness of the energy carrier is a bit low, or it was really when I started this information flow. Awareness at official level is a bit dappled. By official, I really meant the likes of the fire departments, for example. We had a specific case where we were trying to put in hydrogen lines. Some standards have been adopted, mostly through the International Electric Technical Committee, MIRROR, the MIRROR Committee, TC 105. I'll show some examples of that. What we do have here is SAB's Technical Committee 22, Subcommittee 09, which is the alternate fuel vehicles. The CSR has been attending that for quite a few years. They are considering hydrogen and compressed natural gas and liquefied natural gas as options, but I'll mention later exactly where the onus sits to make those things happen. And a really good recent move is that SABs are initiating the ISO Technical Committee 197 MIRROR Committee. Some of the ISO standards which exist, these are international standards. And why I've highlighted some things in blue here, you can sort of see where the focus has been. So it's land fueling systems, fuel tanks, use in airports, roads, again, fuel tanks, a little bit of generators, surface vehicles, fueling stations, generators down here as well. So when the ISO standards were being developed, there was a big focus on use of hydrogen for road vehicles. If you remember back to about 10 or 15 years ago, the idea was it would be driving hydrogen passenger vehicles. That has changed somewhat. EVs have probably won the passenger vehicle war, but there's still a good market for hydrogen in long-haul vehicles, and in shipping and maritime has been talked about as well. So in terms of South Africa, the South African Bureau of Standards develops the voluntary standards. They can be used by regulators such as the NRCS. TCs and working groups are created to facilitate the adaptation and or adoption of standards such as ISO, such as that TC22 I was talking about. Selection of which standards to adopt is largely needs-based. And I think my closing slide, I'll cover that in a bit more strongly, if you like, but we need champions. And SABs need to consider things like impact on social and economic development. It needs to be just. Hydrogen and fuel cell technology has lagged, I believe, largely due to an historic lack of need. We're waking up to the need right now, hence, for example, SABs considering the TC 197 Mirror Committee. The adoption of fuel cell standards was accelerated through the IEC Mirror Committee TC 105, and I'll cover some of that now. But as you can see, again, I've highlighted to show what the focus here was. Stationary, portable, not really road related in general. There was one propulsion, but this is trucks. So the need there was actually for backup power and even primary power in remote telecommunication towers. And this was driven by PowerTech Systems Integration. They now are called something different, a guy called Kenneth Shuda. So they had a very clear need. They needed to have the codes and standards in place so they could provide solutions and technology into this market. And that's what promoted this to happen. So I'm trying to point out that it's really when the need is there and a champion is found, then these things can start happening. I think Lawrence also mentioned a couple of things. We have a lot of satellite kind of codes and standards. We do have stuff in hydrogen detectors because we have been making and using and distributing hydrogen for quite a long while. As I've mentioned, the SABS 22, TC22 is in place. We do have a standard specifically dealing with industrial gas pipelines. That's 10260. We knocked heads with that quite a bit because it was restricted to 16 bar. So even though that was really designed around distributing large amounts of hydrogen, by default, it meant that you couldn't really exceed 16 bar, for example, in a laboratory. And we were trying to work at 200, 300, 400 bar. That was reviewed, and as far as I know, it has been increased to 50 bar, but still, that's not going to meet our needs. So there are the codes and standards, but in many cases, you have to do things like a rational design and present your design to the local authorities, such as the fire brigade or fire department. A lot of design work needs to be done. You need to prove to yourself that it's safe before you start trying to prove to other people. I think Lawrence also mentioned the enabling kind of codes and standards. We have area classification, we have pressure vessel and ATEX standards as well. We have the strong petrochemical through SASL. Then some of the installations that we have in South Africa at the moment, some of these may have actually fallen away since I put the slide together quite a few years ago. But Anglo, for example, put in some fuel cells to provide power to about 34 homes. The backup power to ICT equipment in rural schools. I had my doubts as to whether these were really need driven or whether they were more well, what's the word I'm looking for? But oops, sorry, let me get back again. But they were to basically showcase the hydrogen technology that is available and is actually being developed in South Africa at the moment. It's not all imported. I think we worked here with the South African Collaborative Centre in Cold Chain Management. to, for example, make sure that vaccines went through a completely cold chain. You'll notice that DST or DSI now are very, very involved in all of these, most of these. Chamber of Mines with the DTI put in a phosphoric acid fuel cell. Some PEM, I think, Nicholas, I can't remember if you defined PEM, but it's the proton exchange membrane. It's the one that most of us will think of in terms of either electrolyzer or fuel cells. UWC were driving that. They're part of HISA, as Nicholas mentioned. Telecom backup power, as I mentioned, and these are quite huge numbers. There's 300 units here by Aditech and Ballard, and then PTSI put in about 133. Polano High School has a small unit trying to drive the IT systems essentially. And the DSI again with the Department of Public Works and Infrastructure, Department of Defense, HIPLAT under HISA, Bambili Energy, and quite a few others, including Air Products, put in a suite of fuel cells at One Mill Hospital here in Pretoria, both direct methanol and hydrogen fuel cells. Then just to highlight the assistance we can get out there, if you like. So I was at the International Conference in Hydrogen Safety in 2015, and I mentioned to the group and was responded to later by a guy called Nick Barillo from the Pacific Northwest National Labs and also the Center for Hydrogen Safety. We should actually just enlist the help of established international experts to run workshops and relay the information to South African audiences. For us, we had a specific interest in trying to get our gas pipelines approved, if you like. So we initially focused on officials, but we expanded it through to tertiary education and industry and technicians and artisans, etc. I must say that DSI has also run some very good courses in terms of training technicians and artisans in the use of hydrogen. We had a workshop in Pretoria quite far back in 2016. We had one in Cape Town in May. COVID hit us a little bit, but we actually had a very good webinar held a year ago. That's early March 2022. So here in Pretoria, we had 50 to 60. As I say, most of them were actually from Shwani. We were trying to seed within them that hydrogen can be safe. It's not, we mustn't underplay the risks of hydrogen, but we should be just basically engineer it so that it's safe. Cape Town, there's about 42 people there. Again, quite a focus on the Cape Town Fire Department. My colleague Stan Chidziva from University of Western Cape, HISA, was heavily involved in that. And the virtual webinar was really set up through HISA CSIR about a year ago, and we had 70 people. That was actually very, very good. Generally, we had 3 or 4, even 5 international players, such as Nick Barillo himself, guys from Karlsruhe Institute of Technology. We had the UK involved. We had the US DOE and Sandia National Labs in there as well. So as I say, they happily gave up with their time, and especially the American guys, they were presenting at 3 or 4 o'clock in their morning, giving up their time to join us and present their ideas to the South African audience, totally free of charge. They felt this was just the right thing to do. I've maybe overkilled the resources a little bit. I think there's about 3 slides on this, and I won't go through it in much detail because, yeah, we are running slightly behind. But a very good suite is the H2 Tools that is sitting under h2tools.org. Nick Barillo, who I've mentioned, is very involved in this, and that gives you safety practices, compatibility of materials, including, of course, hydrogen embrittlement, incidents and accidents. I think I've got a specific mention of that later. Some safety training programs they have, compendium that I've mentioned later as well. Then Nick is also involved here, I think, in the American Institute of Chemical Engineers. They have hydrogen safety conferences, best practice incidents, and working groups. HiSafe, more European organized, I think. They also host conferences and generate quite a few reports. I'm pretty sure you will have been through quite a few of those, Lawrence, whenever you were doing your literature review. H2 Edge, they develop training and education materials, generally free of charge. And HyFacts, also just trying to demyth, if you like, hydrogen a little bit, and that's more European or focused. Then just while I was working over the years, these are a few specific resources that I found pretty useful. SANS 10260, even though it constricted us to use of hydrogen, it's a very straightforward document. And if you're planning to put any hydrogen systems in, you need to read this to see how you can play within that, or whether you need to do a rational design if you go outside these kind of limits. Another very good ISO document, the technical report 15916. That's the basic considerations for the safety of hydrogen systems. It is just a technical report. It's not necessarily a standard, but very good advice to be given there. A guy I've worked with for many years, Vladimir Molkov from HySafer at the University of Ulster, my hometown, funny enough, has written a 2-part book, if you like. So he's got 2 books on fundamentals of hydrogen safety, and that's available free of charge, was anyway, through Bookboon. All H2 tools. One specifically that I thought was very valuable was HyRAM, the Hydrogen Risk Assessment Model. That's run by Sandia at this stage, I think Brian Earhart, and the Joint Research Center, and that's on the Europa portal. US National Fire Protection Association, they have huge hydrogen safety manuals, and I didn't write it here, but ESCOM also has a very comprehensive hydrogen safety manual. One of the incidents reported, unfortunately, was a hydrogen explosion in a turbine, which was here. So it's one thing to have the standards, but it's another thing to make sure you follow them. Then these are very, very useful things. The hydrogen incidents and accidents databases, the sort of Euro-focused one, if you like, is the Joint Research Center, and the US focused one is Hydrogen Tools. There's a lot of overlap. Generally, the European one goes a little bit more into the cause, the direct cause of the incident. The belief was US skirts on that a little bit because there could be still litigation happening in a lot of these cases as well. So just the feedback I've had is the European might be more useful for you. Compendium of Hydrogen Regulation Codes and Standards, that's an active link there if you want to follow it. You will be given the presentations later. That wasn't as successful as the organizers wanted because a lot of countries didn't participate. We did. America did, I think Japan did, I think China did, and France, as far as I know, but there was quite a few that didn't. Australia was a notable absentee there. HySA itself, the CSIR, Northwest University, and the University of Western Cape. The work in progress, it was mentioned earlier, there's gap analyses being done for maritime, no, this is new, sorry. The international community is running task forces on maritime, which is headed up by the CSIR, and bulk storage, which is headed up by Sandia under Brian Earhart. So they're doing a gap analysis there. Again, Lawrence, that'll fit in very nicely with your work. And promote my ex-colleagues a little bit. The CSR is producing a Hydrogen Regulation Codes and Standards booklet. It should be out in a month or so. I'll go through this very quickly, but the kind of incidents and accidents there have been is the hydrogen fueling dispenser nozzle. I mean, we've all seen pictures of cars driving down the road with a petrol dispenser stuck in the tank still, but it's apparently happened in hydrogen too, despite all the interlocks that are put in place. The nozzles themselves have a huge amount of codes and standards related to them. Hydrogen leak caused by truck, improperly stored hydrogen filling line. Yeah, fire caused by cascading events. That's one of the things that HyRAM is there for. How far should hydrogen fueling stations, if you like, be from petrol, gas, whatever? Can one trigger an explosion in another? The risk was that you would end up with a hydrogen fueling station in a field somewhere on the other side of town. So HyRAM was trying to really calculate how close these things could or should be. Hydrogen explosion at the coal-fired power plant, that was a bit close to home. There have been a few hydrogen explosions, largely due to inadequate maintenance. They've categorized it into the types of things that we're missing, skills. We've done a little bit in terms of international symposia. The DSI has done a lot of work in terms of trying to train entrants into the industry as well. Operations, you can set up great systems, but people cut corners, people get tired. SOPs get changed, so that we need to be on top of it. Safety, of course. Again, South Africa with its huge mining and petrochem industry, we should be really on top of this, but mistakes still happen. And then awareness, we just need to keep it top of mind all the time. And a few conclusions. South Africa does have a dedicated hydrogen program. It's HySA. It's been operational for about 16 years now. Then codes and standards are required to ensure, number one, we operate safely, but then also that we do not encounter barriers to trade of products. So we could produce a brilliant electrolyzer and try to sell it to the rest of the world and say, no, it doesn't conform to ISO such and such. So we need to make sure whatever we're making here does conform. My opinion is that development of research codes and standards should be needs driven, and the need is really ramping up right now, and it should be driven by champions and should not be driven by the SABS. I think I need to clarify that a little bit. Obviously, the SABS need to be very much on board, but they are more not supervisors, but they must ensure that the regulations are correct. They serve the purpose that was envisaged for them, that they are just, that they don't benefit or they're not a detriment to somebody else. So that they need to be the gatekeeper to make sure that these codes and standards are meeting the needs, but the need needs to be identified by the people that want to, for example, sell hydrogen, green hydrogen overseas, or drive or have hydrogen-driven cars on the roads here. As I mentioned, SABs are initiating an ISO 197 mirror committee. The ISO 197's run by a guy called Andrei Shuvalev. They have a huge amount of standards in place already. Somebody mentioned, was it Lawrence? Mahindra, I think. South Africa isn't an energy crisis. Can hydrogen be used for short and long-term energy storage? It's not going to help us in the next year or two, but maybe as part of our future energy mix. Can South Africa benefit from the global demand for green hydrogen? Lawrence, I think, mentioned quite a bit, as well as basic regulations, codes and standards, the whole certification of what is green. There's a lot of greenwashing happening with various things, not just hydrogen. Try to call this green because we're not going to cut down a forest, for example. So there needs to be very clear guidelines on what is green and what's not. And my one major conclusion is we are not alone. The international community are keen to collaborate and have actively collaborated in the past with us as well. And just one blanket acknowledgement to the DSI for their funding of support and guidance of the HySA program, through which I have gained all my experience anyway in the hydrogen codes and standards field. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. North, for a very interesting presentation with regard to summarizing some of the progress that has been done in South Africa with regards to the regulation codes and standards. And of course, importantly, is to just do what you've done with regard to acknowledging and thanking the Department of Science and Innovation for the funding that they've been supporting us, especially with the engagement that we've had with the international community, and of course, holding the various platforms for sharing information. I think that is very important. So I think, colleagues, we are in that segment for panelist engagement, whereby we'll have questions and answer session. I haven't really seen any questions that have been posted on the chat box, but that does not really mean that people do not have questions. But before we get into people posting their questions or raising their hands to verbalize their questions, perhaps maybe this is a good opportunity to introduce the fourth panelists, Dr. Kabarendo Rambau, who is currently a postdoctoral researcher at the CSR Hub, Hydrogen South Africa infrastructure. And she's been engaged in the space of hydrogen technology and innovation development for quite some time, starting from a master's degree. up to a PhD degree. And of course, she's the person who is currently championing the development of the booklet that Dr. North has mentioned, which we anticipate to be out soon, which will just coalesce all the information that we found relevant, especially with sharing with the colleagues. So we hope that we'll be able to get another platform whereby we can actually share that information. And of course, maybe I would start with posting one of the questions to Dr. Kabarendwe, just to maybe highlight your views with regards to what your views are with regard to where South Africa is. Do you think we are very well engaged with the international community? Do we need to do more? And perhaps maybe what are some of the key highlights of the things that South Africa is engaged in? And maybe what can be done to accelerate them? Thank you. Maybe over to you, Dr. Kabarendwe, to get your comments.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Nicholas, for the introduction. Yes, I do think that we are doing well in terms of engagement, but obviously there's always room for improvements. And I think the participation of South Africa within the IPH is also a best way in order to engage with other countries and governments. For example, we currently at CSR co-leading the Maritime Task Force, already stated by Dr. Brian, and we're working under the RCS working group that is championed by the IPHE RCS Technical Committee. And our main focus is to try to understand the status quo or the relevant information related to hydrogen maritime application in maritime application, also trying to understand the gaps related to codes and standards in maritime application. So we've done some preliminary research, and we found some few results where 8 of the participating countries volunteered to engage with some of their relevant stakeholders in trying to understand what each ministerial government within that country is focusing on in terms of hydrogen maritime application. And we got feedback from around 5 countries. And within those 5 countries, we did find that most of the codes and standards that are common usually are the ones that are on the ISO, the ISO standards, and which is mainly related to the ports infrastructure. And then for the rest of the codes that they've submitted, they don't really specify the hydrogen, but then they are open to modifying it and adapting it to cover also hydrogen. And yeah, so there's still a lot of specifically on that aspect, there's still a lot of information that needs to be covered. And I think South Africa has positioned itself well in terms of trying to cover that aspect in maritime application, given that we're looking to do some export of hydrogen.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rambau, for those thoughts with regards to South Africa's engagement with the international community. Before I'm tempted to ask more questions, I can see there is one of the participants, Ian Govender, who has the hand up. Kindly request that the IT person enable him to voice his question. Over to you, Ian, for your question.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Kindly proceed.
Sorry. I apologize. I actually switched screens and I incorrectly pressed the raise hand button, so I apologize for that.
Oh, okay. Did it mean that you didn't have a question?
I have many questions, but yeah, I think I was just trying to absorb as much information possible.
Okay, sure, not a problem. Maybe more
Thank you,
questions will
Professor.
come as time proceeds on. I think we still have around 20 minutes or so for any burning issue, and of course also comments are also welcome. It's not just about questions. Feel free, if you're told you are shy to voice your questions, you can always type them. We'll always be looking at them. But perhaps maybe I can also pose a different question to the panelists. I can't remember whether it was Lawrence who talked about the need to make sure that we have intensified training with regard to the regulatory codes and standards space. Maybe I would wish to get some comments with regards to curricular development, especially for our tertiary institutions and TVETs, because at the end of the day, we can always not just be reliant on the international community, in as much as we can always wish not to reinvent the wheel. I would want to maybe hear your thoughts on that, and perhaps maybe Lawrence, we can start with you. What's your thoughts in terms of whether there's a need for curricular development, especially starting from the honors levels to masters and PhD levels, and whether we are lagging behind and what needs to be done to make sure that we can accelerate this. Over to you, Lawrence.
Thank you, Doctor. I think Brian should definitely come in on this issue, because I think at the very practical level, he knows probably a lot more than I do. But I think we, as in any field, we need skills at various levels. And I think, as various participants have pointed out, we are fortunate in South Africa that partly because of our platinum resources, we started investing in hydrogen quite early, much earlier than many other countries. And I think the Department of Science and Innovation, as they are now known, rightly have gotten credit for that. And that is the sort of top level skills. That's why we have people now doing postgraduate research, and I mean, I think the main universities, for those who don't know, that are involved is University of Cape Town, University of Western Cape, Northwest University, but I've seen also University of Johannesburg, I think, is now going to have a chair in hydrogen. So at the sort of postgraduate level, I think there's actually good progress. The question is if it's at the right scale. I mean, if we're talking about the kind of hydrogen economy that Mahendra was talking about, I think we will need more people. And I think what already, even in that HISA program, you saw a lot of international collaboration. There are people in those centers of competence that came with their knowledge from Europe and Canada and so on, and brought that skill to South Africa. But by now, I was very fortunate to be in the HISA review in 2019, and I saw young people at UCT and at UWC and Northwest presenting things and clearly being on top of these issues. So I think in addition to that, it doesn't help we just have PhDs and master's degree people that understand hydrogen. As Brian pointed out, if even something like refueling, you need someone who knows how to put a nozzle into a vehicle and to take it out correctly. And I would certainly want there to be firefighters that understand how to fight a hydrogen fire if that becomes something that we have to be ready for. We recently had the very unfortunate gas explosion in the East Rand. So drivers need to know how to handle anything. I mean, there are nothing is without risk. So I think on the safety side, the need for training is from the top to right at the basic level of executing things. So I don't have the solution to that. I think that's one of the things that we need to quantify a little bit better, is a skills development plan. I'm not aware of any specific effort on that, so that would be an interesting thing. But I'd love to hear the other participants' thoughts on this as well.
Thank you very much, Lawrence, for that. And I think you did mention about Brian's maybe having some additional thoughts. Brian, what's your views on that? Do you think we are doing enough, and do you really think we should invest in the technical side of things, especially things that are related to supporting some of these codes and standards, especially material compatibility? Because sooner or later, these installations will require materials. If wrong materials are chosen, and we know very well hydrogen pretreatment is quite a challenge, what do you think in terms of our preparedness level as a country, and making sure that we have a pool of people who are able to engage and not just relying on external experts? Over to you, Brian.
Thank you, Nicholas. I think Lawrence has covered it fairly well. The only thing I would add is I firmly believe we do need training here. We can't send everybody over to America, over to Ireland, unfortunately. We need experts here who can create other experts through training. The one thing I'm sort of missing is we can build a skills base, but in what? So what is the clear plan for South Africa? What are we going to be the experts in? Are we going to be the experts in green hydrogen? Are we going to be experts in building electrolyzers? Did Sama mentioned it there? Are we going to be the specialists in transporting hydrogen? So until we know exactly where we want to play in the hydrogen value chain and what specific technologies we want to use and design and produce, what do we need to train the people to do? I think we should go ahead with some of the basic stuff, like hydrogen embrittlement, the properties of hydrogen, propagation of hydrogen fires. But some of the more detailed nuts and bolts, we need to better understand. I mean, do we need to develop hydrogen refueling nozzles if actually we're not going to ever have any hydrogen vehicles on the road? Are we going to have EV? So we need a bit of technology steer here. Basically, we need strategy steer from probably government. But with that in place, then yeah, definitely we need to be training the right people here and across the spectrum, the nuts and bolts people, the artisans, the people that will even just fuel, because I don't think the public will be allowed to fuel their own vehicles. They're not allowed to use petrol right now. So the guys that use the nozzles on the forecourts will need to be trained right up to the people that design those nozzles. So it's required, but it's going to be needs-based again as well.
Thanks very much.
We can piggyback on the internationals for sure, but we need to get more self-sufficient.
Thanks very much, Dr. North. Kavarendra, do you have any idea of any progress that's happening with regard to curricular development or customization of some of the existing international platforms?
Currently, there's a lot of, like what Lawrence mentioned, that there's a lot of progress in terms of hydrogen materials, but then learning materials, but then it obviously covering the entire value chain without looking into the elements of safety codes and standards related. And I think that's where CSR is positioning itself in terms of having this relevant workshops where we have full technical experts that are serving in ISO technical committees that have done in-depth research that actually fits towards codes and standards. CSR is also working in collaborating with the National Cleaner Production in developing a localized learning material that cover safety codes and standards related to hydrogen. And I think that will be very helpful in terms of covering the people that Brian indicated, the firefighters and the general public that would be handling hydrogen on a day-to-day basis. I think we've positioned ourselves, trying to position ourselves well there, and also trying to establish a research that is mainly focused on hydrogen safety engineering. It can help South Africa in a way because then we could participate on an international stage in a form of influencing some of the decisioning changes towards the development of international codes and standards. So I think universities should also think about that, and also research institutions should also think about research initiatives related to that.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rambao. I see the questions that are streaming in, and this is addressed. This is a question from Zama Duma. It is addressed to all panelists, and it's more of a technical question. I'll just read through it. What is the safest method for transporting hydrogen in South Africa, in the South African context, with respect to the inefficiencies of our railway network? Zama is asking that because of the rope tankers along with the pipelines, which are normally used for the natural gas transportation, which often lead to catastrophe. For example, in the Boksburg accident last year. Perhaps, I don't know who among us, the panelists, would want to respond to Zama's question.
I can make some comments, but I think Brian is probably the strongest of us technically, and Kavin. So I think that hydrogen can be transported safely using any of those mechanisms, whether it's pipeline or truck and tube trailer, or indeed, I mean, you can avoid transporting the hydrogen if you do wheeling. I don't know if everybody knows what wheeling is, but it's if you move the electricity over the grid, so it gets generated in one place and then you make the hydrogen in another place. And I think the estimates that I've seen is that a lot of hydrogen will actually be generated on premises. Certainly in the overseas territories, I expect up to 2/3 of hydrogen to be electrolyzed where at the place of consumption. And certainly the exported hydrogen, I think we'd want to make close to the port where we will export that. So I can't give you an answer on what's the safest way to transport it. I think it'll be the economics that will determine which way you transport hydrogen. Transporting hydrogen via pipeline can actually be very efficient, but of course there's a big infrastructure investment up front. So for things like hydrogen refueling, I think we'll probably start with a central terminal, and we'll have these high pressure tubes on the back of a truck that you move to the different refueling stations. I think that's likely. I think for industrial use, if the volumes are enough, I think either on-site generation or pipes would be better. But maybe Brian has a specific thought on whether there's a difference in safety for the different types of transport.
Brian, over to you.
Yeah. No, each method has its own risks. I personally, I'm very keen on rail transport, but the person that asked the question mentioned that our rail transport is not adequate really in South Africa at the moment. The international norm is really the tube trailers, putting hydrogen on board trucks. It had been put on as compressed hydrogen gas at 700 or even 1,000 bar, and then delivered straight to the refueling stations and then onto the vehicles. The thinking now is to more transport as liquefied hydrogen, mainly because of the energy density. You can increase quite a lot, but it's also much more expensive. It's the single biggest step really. The cost step is to liquefy the hydrogen, and then you transport it and then you gasify it back again to put it back on the cars at 700 bar. That's why a lot of people are looking at ammonia at this stage, certainly for maritime transport, because ammonia liquefies at about -40 degrees, not -200 and something. But ammonia has its own risks. Ammonia is very toxic to the environment. It's flammable in its own right. Ammonia leak at sea can be devastating. So, sorry, that's not much of an answer, but there's a lot of work being done in what is the best way to do it. I saw a terrible video at one of the conferences on hydrogen safety. Luckily, nobody was injured, but there was a truck on fire on a highway. The fire brigade was out hosing it down. They didn't know that truck contained tubes of hydrogen because there was no signage on the truck. So even in Japan, where this happened, there still wasn't codes and standards around signage for transport of hydrogen. So the first responders didn't even know what was on board the truck. So, sorry, it's still very much a work in progress. But again, it's transported lots, certainly overseas, and it's transported a fair bit here. Our knowledge is developing year by year. So we just have to take the best practice.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Brian. For the interest of time, I'm just going to read through some other few questions that are coming on board. And this is a question that is addressed to Lawrence with regard to the study that you talked about. The person is asking, from whom the study was it conducted? Can they look at it? And I think you might have highlighted that in the start of your presentation.
You want
Yeah.
me to answer now quickly?
I think you already referred to it. Maybe once you share the slide.
I can follow up specifically with Nsane on that. It's a GIZ study, and I'm not exactly sure what the confidentiality is, but certainly at the right point. And I think you're from NACI, it would be good if we could share it with you.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot, Lawrence. The second question, I think this one is more addressed to Brian. It's about whether you can recommend a single website or resource that contains the current and the pending or proposed hydrogen codes, regulations and standards in South Africa and internationally, if such a site exists. Brian, what's your thoughts on that?
I wish I could. As I said in the response there, you can start with that international compendium that I mentioned. I think that's the one I provided the link to. There's a slight chance that was a link to the incidents and accidents database, but there is an international compendium where the columns are countries, so France, South Africa, Japan, and then down in the rows, it's spreadsheet based, down in the rows are categories of codes and standards. So we'll have international will be ISO, and then there'll be a SANS equivalent. So that you'll see fairly graphically that South Africa is fairly far behind. Quite a few other countries are quite far. ISO, of course, is leading ASME as well. So from that, you can get a good idea of what is in place, what gaps there might be in South Africa. Lawrence's study was all about the gaps. So reading that through should give you a good steer as well. Other than that, there's a lot of searching. I mean, you can simply Google SABS or SANS hydrogen standards, and you will come up with a list of what's existing in South Africa at the moment. That won't make it clear what the gaps are, but it'll show you what is in place already.
Thanks a lot, Brian. I think we have one of our panelists wanting also to share some more information. Over to you, Mr. Mahendra.
Thank you. No, it is not in connection with that. I just wanted to remind you there's questions also in the Q&A part, and if it's fine with you, can start responding to some of them. So I think the one from Edgar talks about energy generation. And Edgar, you need to clarify if you're talking about electricity, because I think that's what you mean by future power stations running. So I think we need to understand the efficiency of electricity generation using hydrogen. And if we want to do that, the clean way of doing that in the electrochemical process is in the fuel cell. So you're putting hydrogen into a fuel cell to generate electricity. Where does the hydrogen come from? From an electrolyzer. What powers the electrolyzer? Renewable energy. So why do we need to go from renewable energy to hydrogen to a fuel cell to generate electricity when you can just use renewable energy itself? So one needs to understand the inefficiency of that firstly. It's not the proposed method of electricity generation in the short term. And right, we can do PV and battery much more efficiently. So when we're talking about energy as opposed to electricity, we're saying that green hydrogen impacts our energy system broadly in terms of petrochemicals, etc., and natural gas. There's interlinks between that. So we see green hydrogen as, from a longer term, providing energy security in its totality. In the shorter term electricity crisis, we need to be realistic. It's not going to be a solution. Okay, hopefully that answers that question. I think there was another one addressed to me, talking about slide 26 about the 700 bar vessels. I'm not an expert in that area. I think there's still work in progress. From what I understand, the legislation still needs to be changed in terms of 700 bar vessels. If you ask me how that's going to pan out, my opinion would be to follow the big project that's doing this, which is the Rainbow project, the one that's most advanced in the country, although still in pre-feasibility. But when they need to get their projects, their vehicles on the road, they need to ensure that they go through the process with the regulators. And that's all I can comment on that one. There's one more that I indicated that I did want to respond to, if you allow me, Chair. I'm just going through the list, sorry. So the one around, in the commercialization strategy, many actions are mentioned for different government departments. Is anybody monitoring the reality of these actions? Also, the lack of alignment being mentioned time and again. Anything planned to bring better alignment between government departments and green hydrogen? So very important and relevant question, and thanks for that one. We have been very fortunate that a lot of drive has come from the presidency itself as a coordinating entity, government entity in this regards. In fact, you probably know our new minister of electricity was in that department, and he was a very strong proponent of green hydrogen. He was now electricity minister. In that regards, presidency has been driving a lot of the work with the different government departments, also working with the Department of Planning and Monitoring, who have already started engagements. Yes, there are many actions. We're going to limit it to about 2 per government departments that we want them to focus, and the way we're going to get them to implement this is putting it into what's called their APPs, or in other words, their KPIs for the year, and take that forward. Yes, it is early stage, but that's the plan from a coordination and ensuring that something happens. Thank you. I think there's more questions there, Doctor. If you could have a look. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot. Yeah, apologies, I had not really looked at the Q&A section. Maybe let me also try to respond to some of the questions that have been posted here. I'll start with the one posted by Yudi Mabuza, asking about why SABS was not included in the panel. I think that's a good suggestion. I think for the future of the next webinars, I think SABS is an important stakeholder for this engagement. Perhaps maybe this is a suggestion to our our NRF SASTA colleagues to make sure that they're also featured in the panel discussion. There's also about a question with regards to unmanned aviation sector, whereby the person, that is Kevin Jamison, says that there's a gap for the regulation codes and standards. Yes, we agree with that. I think it's still at its infancy. And I think with further engagement, I think there's more work that needs to be customized for each a specific sector within the hydrogen value chain itself. The other question deals with RCS being the best, seems to be the best short term. Let me just try to read it again. I think it just disappeared from me. The best short term way to stimulate development along the different hydrogen value chain. What are some of the main prerequisites that still need to be developed to unlock more advanced uses of green hydrogen, such as sustainable aviation fuel or maritime fuel? I think that's a very important question. I think RCS, together with the technology development and localization of some of these technologies, they actually need to go hand in hand. We cannot isolate one and say we are going to prioritize, for example, deployment of this particular technology without the anchoring need to make sure that all is taken care of, especially from a regulatory codes and standards point of view. I think that's a question that should be looked at it quite keenly. I don't know whether my fellow panelists would want to jump into any of the questions that they would think that would be more relevant to their the expertise. I know, Mr. Ruplan, you've already engaged in some of them, and I'm sorry we are running a bit out of time, but if we can just spare another 5 minutes just to try and see whether we can try to answer as much as possible. Any of my panelists?
I can maybe quickly talk about the question about oxygen, because it was on one of my slides. So certainly byproducts of the whole green hydrogen value chain is something that that could sometimes be used, and oxygen is used in some industrial processes. I think you can get a better quality heat flame in things like cement and copper smelting. So that could be one use of the oxygen that you in a way get for free. The medical world, I don't know what the volumes are that one would need there, and certainly you would also need to make sure that the purity is of the right level. But in principle, there's no reason why you couldn't commercialize that stream. I know in the initiative in the Eastern Cape, where there's a proposal to build a very large green ammonia plant. There's discussions with Cerebos on utilizing the salt that comes from the desalination process. And I think that's the kind of opportunities that also arise when we do something new like this.
Thanks very much, Lawrence. For the interest of time, I don't really see very burning questions. There was one about inclusion of the private companies, and I think that's very important. And I think this was addressed to Mr. Rupla in terms of the mandate of the hydrogen panel. Yeah, I agree that private-public partnership is a very important engagement to make sure that we can actually participate in making sure that we can either develop these codes and standards, or maybe just localize from what has been developed overseas. With the interest of time, in patient, I would wish to end these panel discussions here and hand over to our colleague, Mr. Sizwe Koza, for the closing remarks and vote of thanks. Over to you, Mr. Sizwe.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nicholas Musioka, for that conclusion from the panelist side. Yes, colleagues, my name is Sizwe Koza, and I'm with the NRF, particularly the business unit called the South African Agency for Science and Technology Advancement. And really, my role right now is to give a vote of thanks on behalf of the NRF. So maybe just to firstly start off, the vote of thanks is to really thank our line department, that is the Department of Science and Innovation, who have really been supporting us as NRF SASTA in terms of science engagement and public engagement, and specifically in terms of, doing public awareness and public engagement, of hydrogen and fuel cell technology. We've had a long-standing relationship with them in terms of just, in many respects, including, of course, giving us a specific direction on where the public engagement of this technology needs to go. And then the second, maybe, colleagues to thank is our facilitator, as well as our speakers, panelists as well, who have conducted this discussion diligently, really, in terms of the presentations that they've given us today. You can see the preparation, you can see how they are all in sync, they are all speaking to one another in terms of this regulations, codes, as well as standard. From Lawrence in terms of just talking about how we cannot run this economy or the hydrogen economy on an ad hoc basis, and therefore we need regulations. This is a sentiment that was shared by Brian as well, just in terms of making sure that we don't experience any barriers to trade in this space, and having really champions that are supporting SABS. And then, of course, Mahendra as well talked about this a little bit when he presented the green hydrogen commercialization strategy, touching on the 6 enablers of, what really would then help us commercialize green hydrogen. So really the presentation has, for me, been top notch. They've really been speaking to one another, and they have implications for us, in government, for us in academia, in industry, as well as also other stakeholders. As Dr. Rambau was saying, internationally as well, we're part of the IPHE community. So this is really great for us, and we are so happy as SASTA really to be facilitating this discussion and bringing all the stakeholders, into one space, one understanding. And then the third group, maybe colleagues that I would like to thank, is our long-standing partners, collaborating institutions, and those who would be the HISA group, more specifically, the HISA infrastructure group at CSIR, as well as Northwest University, where Dr. Musioka as well as Dr. Rambau come from. They've really been supportive of public engagement and such initiatives. Also, the HISA system colleague down in Cape Town, University of Western Cape, as well as the HISA Catalysis Group at Mintech, as well as the University of Cape Town. So thank you very much for their support and always being with us in terms of making sure that we host such events. And then the last group, colleagues, is to really thank, or maybe not the last one, maybe second last, our colleagues at NRF, the NRF SASTA team. Many people working, behind the scenes to make sure that what you see today really is a success. And the team, of course, led very diligently by Mrs. Kiribone Monyemote. Thank you very much, Kiribone, for tireless efforts in, engaging with the speakers, making sure that things are done background, as well as, setting up all this, webinar for today. And then the last one, colleagues, is to thank our participant as well. Without you, there wouldn't be any of this discussion. We can have all this presentation, but we won't even be speaking to anyone. And so really, I think the conversations today from the chat that I've been saying, how you think this is a really interesting space for us to be looking into if we are really realistic about, realizing the hydrogen economy. It just shows you that you are interested in the space and you want to, offer your comments as well as your input in terms of how we move forward with this. The question and answer session really was, interesting, some of the questions and suggestions that we got as well as the NRF SASTA. So we're taking them in and going to be considering for the next engagement. And of course, just overall, colleagues, thank you all for making this a good initiative for us, a good event for us. We are really excited moving forward on how we support all of you in terms of stakeholder relations. So I will end it there. Thank you very much. And there is a wrap for us, NRF SASTA and the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sizwe. I declare the webinar closed. Let's engage in future. Bye-bye.